A grueling transatlantic flight just touched down in Chicago. The exhausted man in the faded grey hoodie only wanted to get home. Instead, he found himself shoved into a windowless interrogation room by a notoriously arrogant customs officer. The officer thought he'd caught a criminal. He actually just detained his ultimate boss. Terminal 5 at Chicago O'Hare International Airport was a chaotic sea of exhausted travelers, screaming toddlers, and the relentless hum of rolling luggage. It was 3 p.m. on a dreary Tuesday, and Flight 88 from London Heathrow had just unloaded 300 weary passengers into the agonizingly slow labyrinth of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Among them was Robert Hayes. At 52, Robert possessed a quiet, commanding presence, though today it was buried under layers of deep fatigue. He was dressed in a way that screamed anonymity: a plain grey hooded sweatshirt, well-worn dark denim jeans, and a pair of scuffed New Balance sneakers. A simple black baseball cap was pulled low over his eyes. He didn't look like a man who held one of the most powerful positions in the United States government. He looked like an ordinary, tired, middle-aged black man who just wanted a hot shower and his own bed. Robert had spent the last 4 days in intense, classified counter-terrorism briefings across Europe. He had intentionally flown back commercial, traveling incognito without his standard heavily armed security detail, to avoid drawing unwanted press attention to the covert summit. His protective detail was currently idling in 2 black armored SUVs outside the arrivals curb, unaware of the storm brewing inside the terminal. Robert bypassed the massive, snaking lines of regular customs, heading straight for the global entry kiosks. He slid his passport into the scanner, placed his fingers on the biometric reader, and waited for the familiar green checkmark. "Hey, you, hold it right there." The voice cut through the ambient noise of the terminal, sharp, authoritative, and dripping with unwarranted hostility. Robert paused, slowly turning his head. Striding toward him was CBP Officer Ryan Mitchell. Mitchell was a man in his late 30s, with a tight buzz cut, a uniform that looked overly starched, and a reputation among his colleagues for being a hardliner. In reality, Mitchell was a bully with a badge, a man who consistently used his federal authority to profile, harass, and intimidate passengers who didn't fit his narrow worldview of what a respectable traveler looked like. "Step away from the kiosk, sir," Mitchell barked, closing the distance. He didn't say "sir" out of respect. He used it as a verbal weapon, stretching the syllable with a mocking drawl. Robert remained completely calm, his hands resting easily at his sides. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice low and even. "I said, step away from the machine," Mitchell snapped, his hand resting instinctively and entirely unnecessarily on his utility belt. "We've been having issues with the global entry system, people using stolen credentials. You understand." Robert glanced at the screen, which had already validated his identity. "The screen indicates my entry is approved. My credentials are my own." Mitchell scoffed, looking Robert up and down, taking in the hoodie, the jeans, and the dark skin of the man wearing them. A smirking sneer crept onto the officer's face. "Yeah, I highly doubt a guy flying in looking like he just rolled out of a downtown alley has global entry. Hand over the passport. Now." Technically, as the Secretary of Homeland Security, Robert Hayes oversaw the entirety of Customs and Border Protection. Ryan Mitchell worked for him. 3 levels of bureaucracy separated them, but Robert was the man at the absolute top of the pyramid. Robert knew every protocol, every standard operating procedure, and every civil rights guideline CBP officers were sworn to uphold. Mitchell was currently violating at least 3 of them. Instead of dropping his title and immediately ending the career of the man standing in front of him, a cold, analytical curiosity washed over Robert. As the newly appointed secretary, he had read dozens of internal affairs reports about racial profiling at major ports of entry. He had seen the sterile statistics on paper. Now he was experiencing the raw, ugly reality of it firsthand. He wanted to see exactly how deep this rot went. Robert reached into his pocket, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid giving the jumpy officer any excuse to escalate physical force, and handed over his navy blue passport. It wasn't his official diplomatic passport. He had traveled on his standard civilian one to maintain his cover. Mitchell snatched the booklet, flipping it open. He glanced at the name, Robert Hayes, and then glared at Robert. "Where are you coming from, Robert?" "London," Robert replied smoothly. "Business or pleasure?" "Business." Mitchell let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "Business, right. What kind of business does a guy dressed like a vagrant do in London? You a rapper? A basketball player?" The blatant microaggression hung in the air, thick and toxic. Beside Mitchell, a younger, female CBP officer named Sarah Jenkins nervously shifted her weight. She looked at Robert, then at Mitchell, clearly uncomfortable with her senior officer's line of questioning, but too intimidated to intervene. "I work for the government," Robert said simply. It wasn't a lie. Mitchell's eyes narrowed. He clearly thought he was being mocked. "Oh, you work for the government? Doing what? Emptying the trash at the post office?" "Listen to me very closely, pal. I don't like your attitude, and I don't buy your story. Grab your bag." Robert didn't move. "Officer, I have fully complied with the entry protocols. I have provided valid identification. I am legally entitled to proceed to baggage claim." "You aren't entitled to a damn thing until I say you are," Mitchell practically shouted, stepping so close that Robert could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "You are being selected for secondary screening. If you resist, I will have you forcefully restrained and charged with assaulting a federal officer. Do we understand each other?" Robert stared into Mitchell's eyes. He saw no security concern, no genuine suspicion. Only the fragile ego of a racist man desperate to exert dominance. "Lead the way, officer," Robert said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a chilling authority that for a fleeting second made Mitchell hesitate. But the officer's arrogance quickly overrode his instincts. Mitchell grabbed Robert aggressively by the bicep, yanking him forward toward the restricted doors. The secondary screening area was a stark, depressing corridor lined with windowless rooms, bathed in the harsh, humming glare of fluorescent lights. It was designed to be psychologically intimidating. For a frightened tourist or an actual smuggler, the isolation was terrifying. For Robert Hayes, it was simply an extension of his own department's real estate. Mitchell shoved Robert into Interrogation Room B, a cramped space containing nothing but a metal table bolted to the floor and 2 heavy steel chairs. "Empty your pockets, everything on the table, and put that briefcase down," Mitchell ordered, standing in the doorway to block any exit. Officer Jenkins hovered nervously in the hall behind him. Robert quietly complied. He placed his wallet, a set of keys, and a heavy, matte black smartphone on the cold steel. Finally, he placed his carry-on luggage on the floor and set his briefcase on the table. It wasn't a standard leather satchel. It was a reinforced, brushed aluminum Halliburton case fitted with a biometric lock. Inside were highly classified briefing documents from the London summit. Mitchell immediately reached for the phone. It was a secure, encrypted device issued by the Defense Information Systems Agency. It had no brand logo, no standard operating system, and weighed twice as much as a normal iPhone. What kind of burner phone is this? Mitchell muttered, turning it over in his hands. He pressed the power button, but instead of a standard lock screen, a stark black interface appeared, demanding a complex alphanumeric decryption key. Unlock it. No, Robert said calmly. Mitchell slammed his hand on the metal table, the sound echoing sharply in the small room. Excuse me, you don't get to say no in this room, boy. Unlock the phone, or I confiscate it and hold you indefinitely for obstructing a federal investigation. Robert didn't flinch. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. Officer Mitchell, that device contains privileged, sensitive information. You do not possess the legal authority, nor the security clearance, to view its contents. Under the Fourth Amendment, and specifically under CBP Directive 3340-049A. Regarding electronic device searches, you require reasonable suspicion of a specific customs violation to demand a password. You have none. Mitchell stared at him, momentarily stunned. The average traveler didn't casually cite internal customs and border protection directives. But instead of realizing he was walking into a trap, Mitchell's bruised ego doubled down. He assumed Robert was just a legally savvy criminal, perhaps a high-level drug trafficker or corporate fraudster who had memorized the rulebook to avoid prosecution. You think you're smart, huh? Mitchell sneered, his face flushing red. You think you can come in here, dressed like a thug, and quote the law to me? I am the law in this building. You are a public servant, Robert corrected softly, and currently you are acting as a disgrace to the badge on your chest. That's it, Mitchell snapped. He tossed the phone onto the table and lunged for the aluminum briefcase. If you won't open the phone, we're opening this. What's in here? Cash? Contraband? Mitchell yanked at the latches, but they wouldn't budge. The biometric lock flashed a solid red light. I'm giving you one final warning, officer, Robert said, his tone shifting from observational to dangerous. The experiment was over. It was time to shut this down. Do not attempt to open that case. The contents are classified under Executive Order 13,526. Tampering with it is a federal felony. Mitchell laughed, a loud, ugly sound. Classified! You really are out of your mind. Jenkins! He yelled over his shoulder. The young officer stepped into the doorway, looking pale. Yes, Officer Mitchell. Go to the toolkit in the break room. Get me a crowbar and the heavy-duty bolt cutters. This suspect is uncooperative, and we have a sealed container that requires forced entry. Jenkins looked in the heavy aluminum case, then at Robert. Sir, she whispered to Mitchell. Maybe we should call the duty supervisor or airport police if he's claiming the contents are classified. I didn't ask for your opinion, rookie, Mitchell barked. I told you to get the damn tools. This guy is a nobody, probably a mule trying to smuggle diamonds or fentanyl, playing games to stall us. Get the tools, now! Jenkins flinched, nodding quickly as she turned to run down the hall. Left alone with Robert, Mitchell leaned over the table, placing his face mere inches from Robert's. You see what happens when you don't know your place? By the time I'm done with you, that shiny case is going to be in pieces, and you're going to be in handcuffs, crying for a public defender. Robert looked at the angry, red-faced officer. He felt no fear, only a profound, heavy disappointment. He thought of the thousands of innocent citizens, people who looked like him, but lacked his power, who had sat in this exact chair, terrified, humiliated, and violated by men like Mitchell. You're right about one thing, Mitchell, Robert said quietly, his eyes locking onto the officer's with a terrifying, unyielding intensity. Mitchell frowned, taken aback by the sheer lack of fear in the man's voice. What's that? By the time this is over, Someone is leaving this airport in handcuffs. Robert slowly reached toward his jacket pocket. Hands where I can see them, Mitchell shouted, his hand dropping to his service weapon. Relax, Robert said, his movements deliberate and slow. I'm just giving you what you asked for. Identification. From his inner breast pocket, Robert withdrew a slim, black leather wallet. It wasn't his civilian wallet. He opened it and slid it across the metal table. Sitting on the cold steel, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, was a solid gold badge. Next to it was a laminated federal identification card. Mitchell looked down, a smug smile still plastered on his face. But as his eyes focused on the lettering, the smile froze. His blood ran cold. The color drained from his face so fast he looked as though he were going to vomit. The card read, Department of Homeland Security. The title read, Secretary of Homeland Security. The name read, Robert Hayes. Before Mitchell could even open his mouth to form a word, the heavy door to the interrogation room swung open. But it wasn't Officer Jenkins with a crowbar. It was William Bradley, the Chief of Airport Police, flanked by 4 heavily armed tactical officers. And behind them, looking absolutely furious, was a woman in a sharp, tailored suit, Robert's Chief of Staff, Caroline Foster. Mr. Secretary, Caroline said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Are you all right? Mitchell stumbled backward, hitting the wall, his eyes wide with a sudden, absolute terror. The silence in Interrogation Room B was absolute, thick, and suffocating. The arrogant, swaggering energy that Officer Ryan Mitchell had weaponized just moments ago evaporated, replaced by the raw, trembling terror of a man who realized he had just driven his career and potentially his life off a cliff. Mitchell's eyes darted frantically from the solid gold badge on the table to the furious face of Caroline Foster, then to the heavily armed tactical officers blocking the exit. Finally, his gaze landed back on the man sitting calmly in the steel chair, the man in the scuffed sneakers, the Secretary of Homeland Security. Sir, Mr. Secretary, Mitchell stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, reedy wheeze. His knees actually buckled slightly, forcing him to lean against the cinder-block wall to stay upright. I had no idea. You weren't flying with a detail. Your clothes. My clothes do not dictate my constitutional rights, Officer Mitchell, Robert Hayes said, his voice quiet but possessing the concussive force of a bomb. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The entire room hung on his every syllable. Caroline Foster stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the linoleum floor. We lost your encrypted tracker signal when he brought you into this lead-lined bunker, sir. The Secret Service detail outside was 2 minutes away from breaching the glass at Terminal 5. Are you unharmed? I'm physically fine, Caroline, Robert replied, finally standing up. He casually slipped the gold badge back into his leather wallet. Though I cannot say the same for the integrity of this port of entry. Chief of Airport Police William Bradley, a seasoned law enforcement veteran with a graying mustache, glared at Mitchell with pure disgust. Mr. Secretary, my men and I are at your disposal. Give the word, and I'll have this badge-heavy fool thrown in a holding cell. Please, sir, please, Mitchell begged, holding his hands up in a placating gesture, his face slick with sudden sweat. It was a misunderstanding. Standard protocol. We've had a massive influx of counterfeit global entry profiles this month. I was just doing my job. I swear to God, I was just following standard security operating procedures. Robert turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Mitchell. The cold, analytical detachment he had maintained during the harassment was gone, replaced by the righteous fury of a man who had spent his life dismantling the exact kind of systemic prejudice Mitchell embodied. "Standard operating procedure?" Robert echoed, taking a slow step toward the trembling officer. "Let's review your procedure, Officer Mitchell. You initiated an investigatory stop based purely on racial profiling and socioeconomic assumptions. You verbally abused a passenger. You threatened physical assault. You violated CBP Directive 3340-049A by attempting to illegally search a secured electronic device without a warrant. And to top it off, you ordered a subordinate to fetch heavy tools to forcibly open a biometrically sealed, federally classified container." Robert leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "If I were a normal citizen, my phone would be shattered, my privacy violated, and I would likely be sitting in a local jail right now on fabricated charges of resisting an officer. How many times have you done this, Ryan? How many innocent people who didn't have the power to fight back have you terrified in this exact room?" Before Mitchell could formulate another pathetic excuse, rapid footsteps echoed down the hallway. Officer Sarah Jenkins burst through the door, out of breath, carrying a red steel crowbar and a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters. "I got them, Officer Mitchell. The supervisor wasn't looking, so I—" Jenkins stopped dead in her tracks. She took in the tactical officers, the furious chief of police, the sharp-suited chief of staff, and the man in the hoodie who was currently dominating the room with his mere presence. The heavy bolt cutters slipped from her grasp, clattering loudly onto the floor. Robert looked at the young woman, then pointed at the dropped tools. "Officer Jenkins, is it?" Yes, sir," she squeaked, her eyes wide with panic. "Did Officer Mitchell order you to retrieve those tools to forcibly open this aluminum case?" Robert asked. "Yes, sir, he did," Jenkins admitted, her voice trembling. "Did he inform you that I specifically warned him the contents were classified under Executive Order 13,526? Jenkins swallowed hard, looking at Mitchell, who was violently shaking his head behind Robert's back. But Jenkins looked back at Robert and nodded. "Yes. You told him it was classified. He said you were a nobody, and to get the tools anyway." Robert nodded slowly. "Thank you for your honesty, Officer Jenkins." "Chief Bradley?" "Yes, Mr. Secretary," the police chief responded immediately. "Strip Officer Mitchell of his weapon, his badge, and his credentials. He is hereby suspended indefinitely, without pay, pending a full criminal investigation." Mitchell let out a strangled cry. "You can't do this! I have a union! You can't just fire me over a misunderstanding." "I am not just firing you," Robert said, his tone icy. "I am referring you to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Attempting to forcibly open a classified diplomatic courier case is a federal felony under Title 18 of the United States Code. You aren't just losing your job, Mitchell. You are facing federal prison." Two tactical officers stepped forward. One grabbed Mitchell's arms, twisting them securely behind his back, while the other expertly unclipped his service weapon and slid his badge from his uniform shirt. The sharp click of metal handcuffs, echoing in the small room, sounded like a death knell. "As I told you earlier," Robert said softly, watching the color completely drain from Mitchell's face, "someone is leaving this airport in handcuffs." Within 20 minutes, the entire power dynamic of Chicago O'Hare International Airport had been violently upended. Robert Hayes did not leave the airport. Instead, he commandeered the airport director's sprawling, glass-walled conference room in Terminal 2. Outside the frosted glass, an army of Secret Service agents had finally secured the perimeter, their earpieces buzzing with chatter. Inside, Robert sat at the head of a massive mahogany table. His grey hoodie was gone, replaced by a crisp white dress shirt and a navy blazer that Caroline had retrieved from his luggage. He looked every inch the Secretary of Homeland Security. Sitting rigidly across from him was David Reynolds, the Regional Director of Customs and Border Protection for the Midwest. Reynolds looked like he was suffering a minor heart attack. He had been pulled from a golf course 30 miles away and had broken several traffic laws to get to the airport. "Mr. Secretary, I cannot express how deeply apologetic I am," Reynolds said, nervously dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. "Officer Mitchell's behavior is an isolated incident, a rogue element. It absolutely does not reflect the values of the CBP. Do not insult my intelligence, David," Robert cut in, tossing a thick, newly printed file onto the table. "My Chief of Staff just pulled Mitchell's internal affairs file. 5 civilian complaints in the last 3 years. 3 for excessive use of force, 2 for racially motivated verbal abuse. All of them summarily dismissed by his immediate supervisor. He is not a rogue element. He is a symptom of a culture of impunity that you have allowed to fester under your command." Reynolds opened his mouth to defend himself, but Robert held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "Effective immediately, the Office of the Inspector General will be conducting a comprehensive, top-to-bottom audit of Terminal 5's CBP operations," Robert ordered, his voice echoing in the large room. "Every stop, every secondary screening, every confiscated item from the last 48 months will be reviewed. If the OIG finds that Mitchell's supervisor knowingly buried these complaints, that supervisor will be fired and their pension stripped. If I find out you knew about this and looked the other way, David, I will personally ask the President for your resignation." "Understood, Mr. Secretary," Reynolds whispered, his career flashing before his eyes. "I will cooperate fully with the Inspector General." "See that you do," Robert said. He turned his attention to Officer Sarah Jenkins, who was sitting at the far end of the table, looking as though she were awaiting execution. "Officer Jenkins," Robert said, his tone softening a fraction. She sat up straighter. "Yes, Mr. Secretary. You were complicit today. You stood by while a senior officer violated a citizen's civil rights. You retrieved tools to commit a federal crime because you were too intimidated to challenge authority." Robert let the heavy words sink in. Tears welled in the young woman's eyes. "However," Robert continued, "you also told the truth when directly questioned, corroborating my account against your senior officer. That takes a measure of courage. You are not being fired, but you are being placed on a mandatory 30-day unpaid administrative leave. During that time, I suggest you think very carefully about the oath you swore to the Constitution and whether you have the moral fortitude to wear that uniform. Authority without accountability is just tyranny. If you come back as an officer who protects the public, not one who enables bullies. Do we have an understanding?" "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down," Jenkins choked out, wiping her eyes. An hour later, Robert Hayes finally walked out of the terminal, flanked by his Secret Service detail. The chaotic hum of the airport had faded into the cool, crisp Chicago evening air. He climbed into the back of the armored black SUV, sinking into the leather seat. Caroline Foster sat beside him, handing him an encrypted tablet. "The DOJ has formally taken custody of Mitchell. The press office is drafting a release about the OIG audit. We're spinning it as a proactive administrative sweep." Robert took the tablet, but didn't look at it. He stared out the tinted window as the motorcade pulled onto the I-190 highway. He was bone-tired. The physical exhaustion of the European summit had been entirely eclipsed by the emotional drain of the last 3 hours. "You handled that brilliantly, sir," Caroline said quietly. "You turned a personal attack into a massive systemic reform." "I shouldn't have had to," Robert murmured, rubbing his temples. "I'm the Secretary of Homeland Security, Caroline, and it took me flashing a solid gold badge to stop a man from treating me like a criminal simply because of the color of my skin and the clothes on my back. What happens to the kid from the South Side who doesn't have a gold badge? What happens to the tired immigrant who doesn't know the exact phrasing of CBP, Directive 334, O-049A? Caroline remained silent, knowing there was no comforting answer to that question. "We did good work today," Robert finally said, his jaw setting with renewed determination. "But the fact that Mitchell felt comfortable acting that way in the open, it means we have a long, long way to go." The motorcade sped into the fading sunset. Carrying a man who had just used his ultimate authority not to exact petty revenge, but to shine a blinding light on the dark corners of the system he was sworn to oversee, Ryan Mitchell thought he was catching a nobody. Instead, he caught a hurricane, and the storm was just beginning to clean house. Thank you for watching this shocking, true-to-life story of power, prejudice, and ultimate justice. If Robert's handling of the situation inspired you, please hit that like button and share this video with your friends to spread the message that no one is above the law. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell for more incredible, dramatic stories of undercover bosses and real-life justice. Drop a comment below. What would you have done?